Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today we are gathered to discuss a very exciting and interesting book written by Charles Dallara, who is sitting on my left. I'm sure that all of you know Charles. He was representing the creditors during the negotiations for the PSI, the private sector involvement. Today we're going to discuss the book. I will make some preliminary comments, and I will sit down and I will ask questions to three distinguished people who were involved. Two more besides Charles, Mr. Venizelos on the far left, the finance minister at the time, and Mr. Lucas Papadimos, I guess you all know him, the prime minister of the time. I will just make a few brief remarks. This is a very special book, a very interesting book. It looks big. You have received it, and it is big. It has 36 chapters in 443 pages, and I'm excluding the appendices. Okay. This means about 12 pages per chapter. It makes it easy to read. I read the book in past September, and I guess it took me a full month to read it, because there's a lot of information in it. You cannot absorb it at one time. The book is very well thought and very well organized in the following sense. What impressed me when I had the galleys, that's what I read, was that every chapter begins with a quote. And the quote tries to capture the essence of the chapter. For example, in chapter 2, so if you turn to chapter 2, you will see it's called Navigating to Greece. This is a story of how Charles, at a young age, came to Greece in the 1970s. And actually, he was part of the US Navy. And if you read, before you read the chapter, there's a quote that kind of brings you to the essence of what's there, what to read. It says, the quote, "Happy is the man, I thought, who before dying has the good fortune to sail the Aegean Sea." Nikos Kazantzakis. Yes, so and he has quotes from even Aristoteles Onassis, from ancient philosophers. Every single chapter has a quote. I haven't seen this in another textbook, so it was quite impressive, I remember from the time. The other interesting part of the book is that if you flip through it, and I guess you have it, so you can flip it, there are many pictures, and the pictures are relevant. And some chapters may have 2 or 3 pictures, others may have none, but some of you are there. Definitely the people who were involved in the PSI were definitely promoted. Of course, his wife is in the last chapter. I was wondering, has he put Jean there, but he did. And there are pictures of the late banker, Mr. Kostopoulos, who was heavily involved, and I guess we owe to him. There are also, some of you are quoted in the book. I told Fokionas that his name appeared, so he's going to be searching now for his name. Others as well. Definitely Petros is here because he was involved in the negotiation, and George Zanias is not around, but he's heavily quoted because he interacted obviously with Charles. It covers, the book, mainly the period from June 2011 to about February, March of 2012. But that's the main focus. However, it tries to give you a sense a much longer sense of history. He actually describes Greek history after the revolution. He even engages and talks about previous Greek defaults. And he comes to the present. He talks about the 4 missing years. And here's my question, my quiz question to you. Which were the 4 missing years after the PSI? Anybody? If you think about it and somebody tells you there are 4 missing years, which would be the years? Anyway, I'll leave it at the end. I'll leave it at the end. He's trying, in a sense, the book is more than a dry description of what happened. The book, I would say, after seeing it a couple of times, is really a reflection of his own life, because it has many flashbacks. He describes personalities he has met, thoughts that crossed his mind during these PSI negotiations. People like Paul Volcker is mentioned there. Even there are pictures of him in the book. People like Geithner, of what he told him during the Greek crisis. Of course, all the European leaders, of how he called this person and the other person. So there's a lot. You can read the book and get a feel of the time. You feel like it's a thriller. And I think even Vangelis Venizelos mentioned he described it as a thriller. That's what he felt when he read it. So it's an interesting story. You cannot read it in one night. So I urge you, since I know you got it for free, but it doesn't mean you don't have to read it. You know, it has value, although it was given for free. It has value. So you should read it at your leisure, perhaps during the summer vacation. So these flashbacks are not just things that he thought. He brings many examples of ancient Greece, tries to combine what he observes as Greece. He's trying to present the case to an American. So you have to keep in mind that when you read this book, it's not addressed to a European who understands Europe, but it's addressed to an average American who perhaps has heard about Greece but doesn't know much, has heard about ancient Greece, so is very well sort of marketed towards that person. Many policymakers, I said, are mentioned in the book, and the book also is not easy necessarily, just because it's written so it can be read by everyone. It does deal with difficult topics. For example, the market-to-market accounting, and how he has a full chapter on this, and IFRS 9 accounting stories, and what were they going to do with the PSI and the accounting, essentially. That was the question of the time. And to give you a better feel of the book, I will try to, among all the information that's there, I'll try to tell you that chapter 1 is a teaser. In the following sense. Chapter 1 describes the 2 days of October 26 and October 27 of 2011. And let me remind you what these days were. That's when finally the Europeans, I think the Eurogroup had decided, it was the Eurogroup, I think, that decided of the final, it was not so final, but it was the 50% haircut decision. This was the major thing. And he starts by describing that night. And and I guess a lot of his interaction was with the head of the Euro working group guy, Vittorio Grilli, was Italian back then. And he keeps quoting and saying how Vittorio felt. Here was an Italian who was in charge of the Greek problem, in a sense, But his country, Italy, was affected by it, was not an irrelevant observer. Because if Greece defaulted, then the market would expect Italy to be next. And Charles describes these conversations with Vittorio Grilli, who would tell him, and Charles would sort of try to push him to, I'm not sure, to get information as to where the Europeans were or to try to bargain, but he would get the same answer that he keeps repeating in the book. We got this answer that got us frustrated all along. I have no mandate. So Vittorio Grilli would tell him, I have no mandate. And at some point, Charles erupted. He stood up and he said, well, find someone who has a mandate and bring him here. And lo and behold, actually, Vittorio Grilli delivered. And then he describes how the corridors of Brussels and the building of the Commission, and how he entered a room, and it's interesting to see of who was in the room. That essentially, I guess, he gives us the sense that they were the people that made the difference. It was Herman Van Rompuy, it was José Manuel Barroso, Jean-Claude Juncker, Christine Lagarde, it was Nicolas Sarkozy, and Angela Merkel. So essentially it was two heads of state and the other Europeans. And then the book, now, this is chapter 1. It closes with this picture of we are in this room and now there are these all-important people and we're going to find out what's going on. Then the following chapters do not go on and to say to you what happened afterwards. The book is like this built. Then he starts giving his life story. I told you chapter 2 is about being a naval officer in Greece. And then other chapters. And this discussion continues in chapter 8. It's unbelievable. 8 chapters later, he's giving a very vivid discussion of Nicolas Sarkozy, of how he stood up and he gave it to the bankers. Okay, so you guys are used to it. If I have jotted down his remarks, Sarkozy was saying, "We politicians aren't much loved, but you are positively hated." And yes, it was in French. Yeah, it was in French. And look at you. You are making terrible, disgraceful, outrageous demands on Europe and on the suffering Greek people. If you do not accept in 4 hours our position, that's what he would do. And then he kept screaming and this and that. But Angela Merkel, he says, came later. She was much more quiet. And she delivered the news to Charles that was, well, you should reconsider the 21% haircut in the July agreement and do better. So I guess she didn't deliver the numbers then. It was just asking you to do better. This just to give you a sense of when you read the book, you get a sense, you get the feeling of the players. I always wondered how come IIF kind of became the representative of the bankers. Of course, IIF, the International Industry of Finance, is a club of bankers. It got established, I think, 10 years before Charles joined it. He describes all that stuff in the book. The book has all the information you need to know. You just have to be diligent and read it. And I think I found the answer on chapter 12 on page 115, where Jean-Claude Juncker sent him to Vittorio Grilli, who agreed, who told him, Charles, can the IIF organize Greece's main creditors? This was June 27. This was June 27, early June. Okay. I don't want to take more time. I should just give you a view of how I saw the book when I had to kind of summarize what I thought about it. And I wrote about the book, Charles Dallara, the right man in the right place. Why do I say the right man in the right place? Because Charles was involved with the crisis in Latin America and with the Brady solution. Okay, and he has pictures of that. Charles, the right man, takes us along his long journey of negotiations inside the perplexing corridors of modern Eurozone politics. He provides an eloquent and convincing description of how a few bankers under the IAF umbrella voluntarily initiated and concluded the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history, despite the big loss they suffered. This was always my question. And I guess Charles in the book kind of claims that it was our initiative. We took the initiative and said to the politicians that we're willing to accept a discount, a haircut, because he had the experience of Latin America, where they had tried the reprofiling for 6 or 7 years, it didn't work, and then finally they had to take a major haircut. So he knew, he had this experience, so he had the tendency to understand it, and therefore try to persuade, remember, trying to persuade 50 or 60 or 100 bankers, I'm not sure how many at that time were there, to accept a loss is not very easy. It was always a question I had in my mind. How did the IAF manage to persuade so many people to lose? And he describes, I don't remember where in the book, he describes the first reactions in June, where they told him, and who are you to represent us, some bankers? Why are you doing this? I'm not willing to accept anything more than 10%, and things like that. So there is a lot of this. The book also is a personal story of perseverance and eventual triumph, with vivid descriptions of private discussions with economists, bankers, central bankers, with many key international political figures, and with frequent flashbacks to the earlier Brady plan for Latin America and to various critical historical episodes that formed the modern Greek nation. He does give you Greek history. Now, what's not in the book, the quote I had given, is something that I thought was important. I had picked 2 quotes from the book that I thought was very revealing as to what was going on. And I said, Dallara shares his thoughts and questions with the reader. During a meeting, I think it was a breakfast meeting, he went into the breakfast room and he was wondering, he was looking around, he was expecting. I looked around, he said. They were going to discuss Greece. It was obviously before October. No Greeks anywhere in sight. No IMF, no European Commission, no European Central Bank. He only saw German executives and French people, and he was writing down, did Berlin and Paris really have this much control? To me, this was an American coming to Europe and finally realizing reality of who is really playing, who has power. Maybe so, he says. And on another occasion, he states, I wondered whether some in Europe perceived Greece primarily as a sinner and took the view that sinners need to be punished. So here's an American coming to Europe and getting the sense that something really unfair is happening to the Greeks, that they are the sinners and they need to be punished. Charles says it. It's not a European who has sinned. I'll finish by just, I'd like to quote also from, there are many people's, if you read the book, there are many people who write something, a blurb about the book, and one of them is Alan Blinder, whom I think I have in high esteem. Alan Blinder is an economist at Princeton who also was at the Fed for a while. And Alan Blinder says, Charles Dallara's Euroshock is a remarkable achievement. Remarkable in its authoritative and detailed insider's account of what did and did not happen. Remarkable in the way it weaves, quote, small picture, unquote, details like dealing with collective action clauses with big picture issues like the survival of the Eurozone. Okay. So that's exactly the book. He talks about the small issues and the big issue at the same time. And there is another guy, Jacques de la Rosière, the former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, a Frenchman, who writes something that I want you to think about. A unique case of international financial history. This is the book. The book is a unique case of international financial history. It was the private creditors who initiated a restructuring of Greece's debt, not the public sector. Okay. This kind of permeates the book, that somehow, of course, it's his point of view, that we did it. I guess many people in this room will say, no, we did it. He just followed. In a sense, if you read the book, you will see that the IAF was presented with deadlines. On June 27th, when the first haircut took place of 21%, I think Vittorio Grilli told them, this is what we want. I want you in 7 days to come back and tell us what you need. And that's it. We're not going to argue. And I guess, again, at the end, in October, it was an ultimatum. The Eurogroup gave them a 50% haircut. And I was present in February of 2012 when I really felt sorry, by the way, Charles, I should tell you this. I was there with Lucas Papadimos and with Vangelis. And I watched the negotiations. And I felt sorry because you went from 50% to a discount of 54.5% and just couldn't do otherwise. You know, you can't but feel sorry of someone who's simply losing more and more, and the politicians were out there to get them. Anyway, I'll stop there and I'll sit down, because once you give the podium to a professor, he never stops, so I better stop. So after I gave you this brief introduction to get to the spirit, now we're going to get to the real stuff, which is have a discussion of the participants of the event. And I have 4 rounds of questions. So please, do we have time?
Also answers.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And So. And I'll start with the person to my left, Mr. Papadimos. And I wanted to ask, Mr. Papadimos, you were the Prime Minister, together with Evangelos Venizelos as the Finance Minister. You were heavily involved in the negotiations. What is your overall assessment of the book by Charles Dallara? Specifically, what makes this book important, unique, and different from other books on the restructuring of Greek debt? That's one question. And the second question goes beyond a little bit the book, and is, did the restructuring of Greek debt help save Greece and preserve the Eurozone, as stated in the title of the book? And if so, how? Put differently, to what extent and in what way did the debt restructuring help save Greece and Europe? Because some have argued that the debt restructuring was not necessary, or that its contribution to resolving the crisis was modest. After all, the Greek crisis lasted many more years after 2012. So, two questions. What about the book itself, how it differs? And what about PSI itself, and whether it made a difference? And I ask...
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad to participate in this panel with Charles Dallara and Evangelos Venizelos. I think it brings the three of us back on memory lane. And perhaps at the end of the meeting we can say a few more things about the interactions and negotiations that took place more than 10 years ago. Now, let me try to reply to the first question concerning Euroshock, the book. I think it is an impressive and fascinating account of the largest debt restructuring in history. It is extraordinary and unique because, on the one hand, it provides detailed presentations about the technical and financial aspects of the restructuring and a complicated negotiation process, as well as presents assessments of the political environment both in Europe and in Greece, as well as about economic policy challenges faced both in Europe and in Greece, which shaped the restructuring process. Now, from what I've read in the literature, and this is what makes the book unique, is that most other accounts of the debt restructuring focused either, for example, features of the debt restructuring in Greece and its economic impact compared to the features and the economic impact of restructurings in other countries. Or they tended to focus more on economic and political considerations that led to the need and the decision to do the restructuring. Or even important but more specific questions on whether the debt restructuring should have been actually done at the beginning of the crisis in the context of the first memorandum of understanding and not much later, because in their view this might have been more efficient. All these are important issues, but Charles' book is more comprehensive and unique in that it combines, as I previously said, technical and financial features of the restructuring, detailed description of the negotiating process, as well the political landscape and the economic assessments and considerations in Europe and in Greece that influence both the negotiations and the final product. Now, I think this approach really reflects, to a very large extent, the knowledge and professional experience of Charles, first as, and for many years, in senior positions at the US Treasury, later as the US Executive Director of the IMF, and then for more than 20 years, the Managing Director at the Institute of International Finance, if I'm not mistaken, I think from 1993 until 2013. And I think this knowledge and professional experience is really evident in the book. And if I may say so, I think it was also evident in the discussions that Charles, Evangelos, and myself held when we were discussing and negotiating the debt restructuring. Now, to conclude my remark on this, I would say that the book offers valuable insights into the various and interacting determinants of an extremely challenging and eventually successful debt restructuring. It draws lessons for addressing potential sovereign debt crisis in the future, lessons that may actually become quite relevant in the relatively immediate, well, not near future, because of the rising debt in Europe, in the US, and beyond. Then, as Gikas mentioned, the book offers assessment of how the Greek restructuring helped save Greece from the exit from the euro and how it can contributed to help preserve the stability of the Eurozone as a whole. And it provides detailed assessments of the performance of the Greek economy in various periods. And as Gikas said, there is a chapter which is devoted on the, I'm quoting the title, "The Legacy of Bad Debt and Loss of Autonomy Since the War of Independence." Fascinating chapter. And finally, it concludes by assessing the evolution of the crisis since the debt restructuring. So all in all, I conclude by repeating my first remark. this is an impressive, fascinating, and unique account, an insightful account of the largest debt restructuring in history, with valuable lessons for the future, which I hope are not only drawn, but will also be learned. Now, the short and straightforward answer to your second question, whether the debt restructuring helped save Greece from default and from exit from the euro, and whether it helped preserve the stability and viability of the Eurozone, the short and straightforward answers to both questions is yes, definitely, and yes, definitely. But let me explain a little bit more on why debt restructuring became necessary and how, I think you asked how in particular, it helped save Greece. Now, the first economic adjustment program of Greece, which was adopted in May 2010, it was implemented very effectively for almost 1 year. At the beginning of the program, and during the first year following the program, the issue of debt restructuring was neither considered necessary or advisable. However, since early 2011, it became gradually evident that there were slippages in program implementation, and that could be difficult to achieve debt sustainability as incorporated and the targets incorporated in the program. It also became progressively evident that there was increasing uncertainty about the government's political will, and to generalize, about the will of political parties in general to support the measures of the first program that were necessary in order to ensure debt sustainability. So by the summer of 2011, several policymakers, institutions, and economists concluded that the debt dynamics of Greece were deteriorating, and reaching the desired debt reduction would not be attainable. Further data starting the beginning of the summer and in the course of the summer confirmed this expectation. And it became clear that a new program was necessary, which had to be combined with debt restructuring. Now, as both is said in the book, and I think also Gikas elaborated quite a lot, during the Euro Summit in October 2011, particularly I think it's 26th of October 2011, and following discussions that had taken place in various fora and also in the summit itself, the following conclusions were reached, and I'm going to quote two of these conclusions. First of all, that after difficult discussions, there was a decision that there was a need for a new EU IMF multi-annual economic program, which would be combined, and now I'm quoting, with a private sector involvement, PSI, that would play a vital role in establishing the sustainability of Greek debt, unquote. In that summit, the European leaders, I'm quoting again, invited Greece, private investors, and all parties concerned to develop a voluntary, the word is important, debt exchange with a nominal discount of 50% on national Greek debt held by private investors, unquote. And it was also agreed that the official sector would stand ready to provide up to 130 billion euro financial support until the end of 2014. So at the summit on 26th of October 2011, the restructuring of Greek debt with private sector involvement, the PSI, was sealed. And a key parameter, the 50% haircut on the nominal value of the debt was defined. Now, the main point, I'm coming to the end of this, to keep in mind in assessing the contribution of debt restructuring to helping Greece, to help save Greece from exit from the euro, is that first, the formulation of a credible new adjustment program, the provision of 130 billion euro financial support, and the restructuring of the Greek public debt were intertwined. They were the three inseparable elements of the new policy package. So what, of course, had to follow was carrying out, and this is between us, the three of us, the difficult and interdependent tasks associated with designing a credible second program and its approval by the institutions and the European partners. Second, the negotiations about the features and the debt restructuring and the eventual agreement between private creditors in Greece about that restructuring. And what was very important, it was essential that the program and the debt restructuring had to be mutually consistent and in line with the total amount of available financial support in order to reduce the debt to GDP ratio to 120% by 2020. So all these tasks, it was needless to say, and I think all three of us know this very well, was a daunting set of tasks to be performed. But I think we're happy to say that these tasks were carried out in the spring of 12, sorry. First of all, the program was approved, as well as the details of the debt restructuring in February. The debt restructuring was completed in March, and the first sizable part of the financial support, amounting to 75 billion euro, more than half of the total, was provided in April. This is how the debt restructuring helped save Greece from a disorderly default and an exit from the euro. One final point. Without the approved second program and the completion of the debt restructuring, Greece would not have the necessary funds to repay at the initial nominal value the large amount of outstanding debt which was maturing in the first half of 2012. This would result automatically and immediately not only to a default, but also the exit of Greece from the euro, because the European Central Bank cannot and would not provide any funding to banks of a country that has defaulted. It would happen the next day if we were not in a position to repay at the initial nominal value, not at the new nominal value, the bonds that were maturing. And this, of course, and I think all of you on the first lines know, would lead to immediate collapse of the banking system with incredible consequences, very horrible consequences for the Greek economy. So, needless to say, that such an outcome, just one sentence for Europe, would create a huge financial turmoil in the Eurozone as a whole, and will increase pressures on vulnerable countries, such as Portugal, Ireland, Spain, potentially Italy. And this would really threaten the viability of the Eurozone as a whole. So the debt restructuring and the second economic program together contributed to preserving the stability and viability of the Eurozone. Sorry, it was a little bit longer.
It always happens, because the first one that answers gives the... I'm going to turn now to Mr. Venizelos. Mr. Venizelos, you definitely interacted with Charles extensively during the negotiations. How would you describe the role of Charles, and how would you characterize his contribution today, 12 years later? That's one question about Charles. And the second one is, again, the same question I asked Lucas. Charles, in his book, considers the restructuring of the Greek public debt as an event of enormous importance for the international economy, as an intervention that saved Greece and preserved the Eurozone. Do you agree with this basic position of Charles?
Help save Greece.
So thank you very much, Gikas, for the question. I must start from the end. The final historical assessment is that Charles is a friend of us, a friend of Greece, and also a world chapter of the Greek financial and political history. As you know very well, Charles Dallara, together with Jean Lemierre, the president of BNP, was the representative of the negotiator on behalf of the international private sector, of the international banking sector. On the other side, in the first stage of this procedure, I, as the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of George Papandreou government, was the negotiator and the interlocutor of Charles, and after the appointment of the new government under the primership of Loukas Papadimos, this tandem, Loukas and I, was the counterpart of the other tandem, Charles Dallara and Jean Lemierre, because the legal frame of this procedure was a pure initiative of the Greek Republic in order to organize an exchange of existing bonds with new bonds on a voluntary basis. The participation of the other key factors, the Troika, the institutional partners of Greece, the European Commission, the Eurogroup, the European governments, the IMF, the European Central Banks are just observers in this procedure. This is something very critical and very decisive for the legal and financial integrity of this procedure. Charles, as you understand and as you know, is a great professional, an American citizen but a cosmopolitan. He knows very well Europe, he knows very well Greece. He is in position to understand the context and also the correlation of forces. Charles is a great writer now, because we have here not a kind of ex post financial assessment. Charles is not the historian of IMF, nor the chair of the evaluation committee of ESM or of IMF. He's a great author. We have here, thanks to this book, a personal narration in context, a kind of complex and perplex historical narration concerning the period, the country, the people, and also the financial frame. Charles is also a pro-European professional because he is an excellent and famous manager of the private sector, but finally, he is always a kind of public servant, not of public servant of the American administration, but a public servant of the international economy. This is something very important. On the other hand, we must take into consideration that Charles represented the IIF, an international institution. Jean Lemierre, the other friend and negotiator, represented the banks as enterprises, as entities of the private sector. This is something very important, because Charles was always in place to understand the difficulties and also the sensitivities of this procedure. And the contribution, the personal contribution of Charles is absolutely historical. I remember very well, to be more concrete and to offer some additional information. I remember very well our last meeting during the critical session of Eurogroup in February 21st of 2000.
Almost 22nd, because early morning.
Okay, 21st, 22nd. This is the bridge. 2012. In a small and dark meeting room in the offices of the Greek delegation in the Council of Ministers of the European Union. We have the last meeting officially between the Greek government, the Hellenic Republic, as the owner of the procedure, and the private sector, represented by Charles and Jean Lumiere, and the other key factors, the European Commission, the Eurogroup, the Euro Working Group, the ECB, the IMF, are just observers, supporters, but legally speaking observers in this procedure. And I'm in the difficult position to make the critical announcement that finally the cut is not 50% of the face value, but 53.5%. A last minute upgrade of the cut. Why? Because according to the debt sustainability analysis, we must take this level of haircut in order to present, mathematically speaking, an acceptable solution. And as Charles knows very well, every debt sustainability analysis is always something in between science and art, knowledge and intuition. And he understands very well that the international private sector must accept this solution as the final solution. We started our negotiation in July 2011 on a totally different ground. As you know, or as you remember, I hope so, because we must remember in details this case. According to the first decision of the European Council, the proposal for the PSI was on the level of a cut of 21%. And this was the implementation of an initial secret decision, secret deal made between I and Wolfgang Schäuble in Berlin during the first week of July 2011. The German government, Schäuble, and the Greek government, represented by the Minister of Finance, know very well that our final target is a haircut of 50%. But we start as a kind of sweetener with the proposal to organize a haircut of 21%. And I remember very well, one day before this critical session of the European Council, our first meeting, our initial meeting with Charles Dallara and Joseph Ackerman in the lobby of Sofitel in Brussels, in Place Jourdan, the private sector was very happy because, according to the international accounting rules, the banks must accept a haircut on this level, 21% in the books, because the market value of the Greek sovereign debt was nothing, zero, null. And from this point of view, this proposal was acceptable. And this is the rationale in the background of our common decision, common with Wolfgang Schäuble, to start this procedure through this very friendly and acceptable proposal. But the target and the orientation from the very beginning was to catch the final haircut of 50%. And you know the story, the final decision was 53.5% in order to make the acceptance or the equilibrium, the equation, to speak more technically, between the debt sustainability analysis and the final legal scheme of the PSI. But until now, we talk about the PSI, and you know very well the figures and the scheme. As you know, the PSI is just the first pillar of the intervention and for the reconstruction. To be more concrete and more fair, the PSI was the first step toward the second and more decisive step, the OSI, the official sector involvement. Because the official sector involvement is until now the real salvation of the country. Because the official sector involvement through the cut of interest rates, the prolongation of the average duration and of the maturation of the debt, and also through the grace period, and also through the impressive cut of the annual servicing cost for the Hellenic Republic, change the depiction of the debt for every normal country, member of the Eurozone. The difference between the face value of the debt and the present value of the debt is something between 1 and 5%, especially for Greece. Until now, the difference between the face value of the debt and the present value of the debt is more or less 80%, and this is the very explanation for the sustainability of the debt, and this is the influence and the interference of the famous operation for the reconstruction of the Greek public debt from 2011 until now. Not only until now, but until the end of the grace period in 2032, and maybe many years after, if the Greek government now has real awareness about the situation on the ground and for the future. From this point of view, Charles is not only the author of a book, not only a great actor of this perplex and ambitious operation, but also a chapter not only of the history, but also of the future of the Greek economy.
Thank you. I understand you want to say something,
Just
Lucas?
a quick supplementary remark with what Evangelos just said. I hope you could hear me earlier.
Yes, they hear you.
First of all, I think it's clear to all of us, and I think Evangelos underlined this, that a haircut of 20% would have made very little difference in order to achieve the desired reduction of debt, of Greek debt, to a level of about 120% of GDP. But in this final Eurogroup meeting, where the particular meeting that Evangelos described took some time in the middle of that meeting, there were two additional things that I think it would be worth to highlight. First of all, I think at that meeting, as was just said, the private creditors, under the leadership of Charles, agreed to increase the haircut from 50% to 53.5%, which was something that was necessary but not sufficient in order to ensure that, given the program, the debt would be assessed to go down to 120% of GDP by 2020. So in the Eurogroup meeting, and at the same time, it was decided that the official sector would also make an additional contribution to the financing. And that contribution resulted from an agreement that resulted after a very long discussion in the Eurogroup that the national central banks that were holding sizable quantities of Greek debt would return to Greece the revenue acquiring to them from holding these instruments. So although they would not be forced to have a haircut on their holdings, the revenue would be returned. And the amounts that were contributed...
From SMP and Alpha programs?
Yes, and so the relative amounts that were contributed by the private sector, by increasing the haircut, and by the official sector, namely the national central banks primarily, would be sufficient in order to ensure that given the program and the debt restructuring, there would be sufficient resources, so to speak, in order to go down to 120% of GDP. And one final point, if I'm not mistaken, during that meeting on February 22, there was an additional adjustment on the interest rate that was going to be, unless it was done the day before, on the interest rate that would be related to the new bonds. Because, one final remark and I'm closing. In addition to the haircut, there were two additional features that characterized the restructuring. And the additional features was that the old outstanding bonds would be replaced by new bonds that had much longer maturities and substantially lower interest rates. So it was an additional contribution. It was actually part of the long discussions between us both in Athens and later. And I think this also played a role in, it shows that the debt restructuring also made a contribution in the future. Because
so all the future reliefs were
the following years,
okay.
Because it would imply that if the interest rates had not agreed to be much lower compared to the old ones, and if the maturities had not increased, then greater fiscal adjustment would be required in the future in order to ensure that sustainability.
Okay. I will let Vagelis just jump.
Just one remark.
1 minute.
Concerning the historical data. During this historical session of the Eurogroup in February 2012, the last meeting, the proposal for the return of the so-called benefits of the central banks of the member states through the European Central Bank to the Hellenic Republic from the two portfolios of AMFA and SMPs was a proposal made by the Dutch Minister of Finance, a very tough guy during this very difficult and dark period of the negotiations for the Greek economic crisis. This is something important.
Before I turn to Charles, I know you are confused with all the numbers. It was technical details, and they were very important. I can tell you my experience. 4 o'clock in the morning on February 22, whatever it was.
You were there.
I was there.
We were all there.
Yeah, and I remember the agreement was sealed. All the finance ministers were standing up, and they were very happy. Like we gave it to the bankers. I mean, we got what we wanted, and they were like congratulating themselves. And Christine Lagarde stands up and says, "Wait a minute! Don't be so happy. In 2 years, maybe 3, Greece will be back and ask for more money." And I said to myself, oh my God, the IMF doesn't believe the program. Do you remember that? Yeah, the IMF.
No, because he does not.
Anyway, now I'm turning to Charles. Charles, you have been involved in many sovereign debt restructurings over the years, dating back to your days at the US Treasury during the Latin American debt crisis. The restructuring of Greek debt seemed, however, unusually difficult. What were the exceptional features that made this restructuring so unique? Do you remember?
Well, Geekos, let me first thank you for organizing with your colleagues and and staff at the Hellenic Banking Association this gathering this evening to give us an opportunity to share our memories and our perceptions of the book. And you three eloquent gentlemen have I think, laid out many of the crucial points here, and it saves me from covering a lot of the same ground. But I think it is important to understand that this restructuring did present unique challenges for the system as a whole, for the world of sovereign debt, and for Europe in particular, and of course for Greece. Why was it so complicated? First of all, it was the first major sovereign debt restructuring in modern finance that included a country that was part of a major currency zone. Let's face it, when we did this restructuring, the euro had been in operation less than 15 years. It had been conceived 2 decades prior, but it was still a fairly new phenomenon. And it was the jewel in the crown of European integration at that point, and probably still remains so in many ways. So the debate over when and how and whether there should be a restructuring was increasingly twisted because of this reality that Greece was a part of a common currency, and there was a profound uncertainty as to whether or not a restructuring of a country, yes, supposedly relatively small by Eurozone standards, but nevertheless a critical member of the Eurozone, whether the restructuring would mean the death of the euro as we knew it, or whether it was a restructuring would actually preserve it. And many of us, as Lucas explained, increasingly came to the view in the first half of 2011 that, painful as it may be, that a restructuring was necessary to preserve Greece's membership in the Eurozone and to preserve the euro as we knew it then. However, that view was still hotly debated right up until the summer of 2011. We had very distinguished leaders, many of whom I consider dear friends and hugely respect, such as Jean-Claude Trichet, who felt that a restructuring might actually undermine the fundamental credibility of the Eurozone. And this debate went on for much of the first half of 2011. It was at that point that, and I would never, and I hope it didn't come across quite that way in the book, because I would never claim that we, the bankers, did it, but I would submit to you that we initiated the process, because someone had to start the ball rolling. And I had endless discussions with Trichet in the early part of 2011, and Jean-Claude, always with the great respect and professional courtesy that he showed, consistently resisted the idea of restructuring Greece's debt, even when the balance of payments analysis and fiscal situation increasingly pointed to the need for that restructuring, as Lucas pointed out. Secondly, it was difficult because of the odd way in which Europe organized the negotiations. As Gikas mentioned in referencing some parts of the book, I was experienced in dealing with a lot of sovereign debt. I would have certainly welcomed an opportunity to sit across the table from a gentleman who is sitting here now, Petros Christodoulou, and his colleague, George Zanias. I'm not sure whether George is with us tonight, but they were the initial representatives of Greece at the senior working level talks. But I was told that no, they are an important part of the dynamic, but that the chair of the negotiations on the other side was an Italian deputy finance minister. Now, scratch your head. Here we have Greece in extreme difficulty. We have another country, much larger, also in extreme difficulty. And one of those countries' deputy minister is told he must represent the other one, when his concern every night when he went to bed is that his economy was about to fracture and collapse. So there was a bizarre dimension to this, exacerbated by the fact that in the first month of the negotiations, no one in Europe was empowered to give instructions, direction to this Italian deputy finance minister. So we had fruitful exchanges with Evangelos at that time, but the situation remained very murky because it seemed like no minister was really, and no ministerial group and no group of heads of state was prepared to actually say, we need to embark on a restructuring. I think there was a third element that made this particularly difficult, and that was or maybe two more elements. That one was that there clearly was a sentiment that was very evident, and I don't wish to point fingers at individuals, but a sentiment among some Europeans that, yes, as I wrote in my book, Greece was a sinner and should be punished. Now, I'll recall a brief story from early in my career, if I may. I went to Mexico in the late 1970s as a young Treasury officer with a senior official at Treasury to discuss the economic problems of Mexico. This was 3 years before they approached a point of complete default. And we began discussing Mexico's economic policies, and I was young, full of what I thought were great ideas, and I began to tell the finance minister what I thought he should do to fix the problems in his macro economy. And he listened, and we had a good exchange, and when I walked out, my senior Treasury colleague turned and said to me, Charles, you made some good points, but remember one thing, we're not down here to lecture anyone. We're not down here to punish anyone. We're here to solve problems. And that's the bottom line of it. And I've always remembered that discussion, that you have to be a problem solver when you are in the middle of these kind of difficult situations, and that condescending lecturing, I'm going to punish one of the parties here, never provides a direction to a solution. The fourth element that made it difficult was the way in which Greece entered these negotiations, the very abrupt disengagement from the global markets. This was not a gradual situation. If all of you will remember, and I'm sure you do, because so many of you have been directly or at least indirectly involved, that in the fall of 2009, a new government arrived. Evangelos, very capable predecessor, discovered that within a matter of months, and there were some others involved at the time, that discovered that, well, the fiscal deficit is not 5%, it looks more like 8%. No, it looks like 11%. Oh, we think actually it's 14 or 15%. I mean, this was a dramatic series of damaging bits of evidence about Greece's own economic management, and revealed also an utter inability of the markets to have monitored the risk of Greece during the 2009 period. The only bankers who I think really understood the deterioration in Greece's creditworthiness are those represented in this room tonight. The Greek bankers.
Bankers are silent, however, usually they don't like. Yeah, can I ask you another question now? We're going to round two. Round one lasted 1 hour. Round two should last 5-10 minutes, so we can finish everything. You mentioned in the book contributions that the restructuring made for both Greece and Europe. Could you please elaborate a bit more what those contributions were, both quantitatively and perhaps more systemically? And how have they contributed to Greece's current economic recovery? You have a view?
Well, you know, Geekas, fortunately, Lucas and Evangelos have already shared with you a lot of the crucial numbers that were involved. I'll mention one or two, but I think at this late stage in our dialogue, we should focus on the broad contours of the process rather than the numbers. But in one morning, as Lucas and Evangelos and Petros and many others will remember, we absolutely extinguished 107 billion euro of debt. And most of this, not all of it, but most of this was done in a very voluntary, cooperative, negotiated fashion. Unfortunately, some of that debt was held by the Greek banks here, and as we know, this decision painfully undermined and weakened dramatically the capital base of these banks, from which I am delighted to say they have all very impressively recovered, and it speaks to something I knew already, and that is the quality of Greek banking, which I never really had any doubts about. I had the pleasure of working with many Greek banks over the years, and you will see in the book, you will gain a bit of a better sense of my thoughts about Greek banking at the time, and I would just like to pay tribute to one distinguished Greek banker who's no longer with us here today, Yannis Kostopoulos, a dear friend of mine, and someone who, to me, was always a giant of Greek banking, and his influence remains today, and I tried to capture a little bit of his important role in the book. But I just want to say that we extinguished that debt. It was equal to 53% of Greece's GDP, imagine. We took another 100 billion of debt, and as Lucas and Evangelos said, we stretched it out over 30 years, and with concessional interest rates. And at that time, they were very tough negotiators, you know, and not an easy tandem to deal with. You know, I had this mild-mannered economist who suddenly turned into a highly capable political leader, and then I had this highly educated, intelligent attorney who had the fastest learning curve as a finance minister I'd ever seen. And so dealing with these two gentlemen, particularly with you advising them, Gekas and Petros in the background, also steering things, it did not make it easy for us. But in the end, I knew we had to make a profound concession. And the final numbers, 53.5%, didn't fully capture it, because those of you who are in banking know that you have to measure the net present value of the loss, the value of those future cash flows. And we calculated the day we agreed to this that it was not 53.5%, it was 73%. And I still think that was a fair assessment of the losses. But you know, I tried to convince the bankers at the time, and I think we successfully did, that their losses were going to be painful, but it was nothing compared to what would happen if Greece was forced out of the Eurozone. I am convinced to this day, as Lucas mentioned, it would have been devastating, not just for Greece, but for the entire constitution of the European economy. And I think the bankers eventually understood that, because most of them are not just bankers, they are also leaders of Europe. And I think this had an impact. The final point I would say is that the numbers pale in comparison, I think, to the valuable contribution of avoiding that precipitous default that, as Lucas said, was right around the corner. It was only one part of the equation. We had the crucial reform program, which Lucas and his cabinet and Evangelos had negotiated in a very difficult fashion with the IMF through Parliament. But we also unleashed the so-called PSI, unleashed a new round of generosity from Europe, because it demonstrated that the bankers were willing to give a pound of flesh in a substantial way. And this unleash of new generosity involved concessional rates and a restructuring, never a reduction of the debt, but a restructuring of the debt, which to this day continues to benefit the cash flow requirements of Greek debt.
I'll move quickly now. I have one question, the same question to both of you. And I'll start with Vangelis first. I think Lucas already alluded to this. There was a debate at the time, and it's being the questions all over that somehow, and I remember the IMF was insisting, whenever the IMF gets involved, it wants first to see a restructuring happen and then give help. How come, although we had a problem by May of 2010, and we had the program, how come we didn't do the restructuring earlier in May of 2010, and we did it in March of 2012? Were there restrictions, obvious things that we couldn't do? And was this detrimental? Had we done the restructuring 2 years earlier, maybe we would have this huge recession that we followed? I mean, what's your view when you compare the two dates?
Gigas, thank you very, very much for this question. This is the main historical question for the assessment of the three adjustment programs of the crisis period. In the very beginning, during the first semester of 2010, it was absolutely impossible for the European Union and the Eurozone to understand the very idea of intervention for the reconstruction of the public debt of a member of the Eurozone. First of all, for legal reasons, because according to the treaty, according to the initial version of the famous Article 136 of the Treaty for the Function of the European Union, it was legally absolutely impossible and prohibited to organize such operation, not only for the reconstruction, but also for the bailout itself. As you know, the revision of the treaty was a step later, not during the preparation of the first program. The conception, the European dominant conception concerning the situation of the economy and the so-called economic crisis was very paradox. The European conception is a Kantian one. Europe respects Kant not only on the field of the foreign policy and security policy, but also on the field of economic, financial and fiscal policy. From this point of view, the conception for the itinerary of the European economy was absolutely linear. The central idea was artificial normalcy of the European economy through the Eurozone, for the Eurozone, without any case of crisis. The crisis was something absolutely exotic for the European Union during this period. This is the first point. Legal and ideological caveats. The second point is the direction of the European Central Bank. As you know very well, Jean-Claude Trichet, as Lucas knows very well as former Vice President of the Central Bank, Trichet was absolutely against, absolutely hostile. On the other hand, the position of the IMF during the first period was very reluctant. The official position of the IMF was in between, not directly for a reconstruction from the beginning, from the starting point.
Because the Germans and the French influenced the IMF, no?
Maybe. As you remember, the period was very difficult for the IMF after the scandal concerning the managing director, etc., etc. The third point was the reaction of the Greek government itself, because it was absolutely impossible for the Greek government in the era to demand and to present the claim for a radical reconstruction of the public debt. And finally, the first program itself, the first loan, was a newly, totally hybridic situation. The Greek loan facility was something very artificial, without legal frame, on the sidelines of the European Union as legal entity, and without the participation of the federal German Republic itself. The scheme, if you remember, the legal scheme of the Greek loan facility was the participation of 15 members of the Eurozone, without the participation of the Slovak Republic, and the participation of KfW, the German investment bank, as a representative of the Federal Republic, not the legal entity of the German Federal Republic itself directly, in order to avoid liabilities and also in order to organize a kind of bypass before the eyes of the Federal Constitutional Court. This is the main explanation. During the first semester of 2011, we have many game changers. The election of Mario Draghi as the next president of the ECB. The change of the position of the IMF. The IMF is now stronger. We have also the change of the position of the German government. The initial paper for the idea of the reconstruction is a paper signed by Wolfgang Schäuble concerning the so-called rollover, the prolongation of the maturities. Okay, technically this is something very limited, but the political idea, the political acceptance of the idea of reconstruction, of an intervention in the Greek public debt within the Eurozone, was something very important, and this is the background for the initial deal with Schäuble concerning the intervention.
Thank you, Vagelis. Now, I guess you mentioned all the obstacles. I will ask Lucas, as an economist, would you have preferred to see the restructuring happen in 2010? Okay. Would this be beneficial to the economy if it had happened earlier? Okay. Assuming we could do it. Somehow we had the maturity and we had the legal structure.
There are four different arguments. Let me start with a general statement, which I will explain. That in April and May 2010, when the second program was designed and when the program was adopted in May, leaving aside legal arguments, either more general or related to Greece, a debt restructuring was not considered necessary or desirable for a number of reasons, and I'll answer as an economist. First of all, because given the program at the time, it was considered that debt sustainability could be attained provided that the program would be implemented effectively. This is the economic part. Now, of course, economists can have different views, but the dominant view, shared officially and unofficially, I'll say this is important, not only by the European partners, the Troika, okay, the European Commission, the ECB and the IMF, was that the first program could be implemented and the debt would be sustainable. Now, of course, this, of course, required effective implementation. And as I think all of us agreed, during the first year, the implementation was effective. Now, about the position of the IMF, the way it has surfaced somehow many years later. I was not at the time a former president of the ECB, the vice president. I was the vice president of the ECB. And I have all the official documents relating to this issue between the IMF, the ECB, and the Commission, and I was present or informed about all informal discussions. Never the official position of the ECB was that a debt restructuring was necessary, period. Now, some economists there, as many economists can, could have raised doubts about the sustainability issue, and especially ex post. But this was not the official position. So this was out. Now I'm coming to a second point, which relates to the view that President Trichet expressed more strongly, but I can say this was the view of the executive board of the ECB. It was not only Trichet's position. And relates to the point made by Charles, that Greece was and is a member of the Eurozone. And starting to discuss something that was not even necessary from an economic point of view at that point in time, the possibility of a restructuring of the debt would imply considerable risks of contagion for other countries that were also fiscally vulnerable. And although they did not face the big problems that Greece was facing, it was clear to us that Portugal, Ireland, and possibly, if contagion is spread, Spain in the banking system could be affected. And this was a very serious consideration, which doesn't have to do with, let's say, straight political view, but for a country that is a part of the Eurozone, it is very important to see whether debt restructuring will have wider Eurozone implications. And I come into the third reason that I think has hardly been discussed. At the time, a debt restructuring could not be done to the extent it was done and in the way it was done in 2012. And why not? Because, and this depended very much on the haircut that would be decided. If the haircut at the time was very small, it would have literally very negligible effect on the debt dynamics. But if the haircut was going to be forced on the private sector to be big, this would not be, in quote, as stressed by Charles and in his book, a voluntary exchange. And at the time, I recall, the market valuation of the Greek debt was quite high. It was not 50% of the nominal value. So a haircut that would be substantial to make a difference could not be achieved without being interpreted as a forced restructuring and therefore a default. So this was the practical, fundamental, economic, and policy reason that suggested at the time that it didn't make sense. It was neither necessary nor advisable.
You allow me a journalistic question, excuse me, a journalistic question. Yeah, since you said you know all the inside, you have all the documents. I'm curious to know, did the IMF push for a restructuring in your exchange with the ECB? You were the vice president, you saw all the documents. Were they really discussing restructuring, or it's an invention?
The first period?
Yeah, early on. And I'm asking him.
Let me say the following. I think I said it, but let me repeat it. First of all, officially there were no documents discussing restructuring. Second, informal discussions that had taken place, some of which I was present and some of which I was not, but I had a clear communication with Trichet. Such an issue was not brought. What I think has happened is that some economists, not I think in the European department, but in another department, had raised doubts about that sustainability. And given these doubts, they came to the conclusion, as far as I know, these conclusions, maybe inside an institution, were exchanged, but they were never adopted by the institution itself, came out later, having seen, unfortunately, how we were not able in the following 2 years to achieve the targets, and the debt sustainability changed. So ex post assessments, I think, gave support to the arguments of these people, and as we know, in any institution, either an official institution or a private institution, there are different views. So I cannot say that some people did not think about it, but this was not the IMF. Okay. I think there were also, can I say something? I was told, and you can, both of you can correct me, that in a discussion in the executive board of the IMF, a representative of one or two Latin American countries, I will not mention, brought this as an issue. possibly because of their own experience.
Yeah, it was written. It was
but not realizing the specifics that are relevant for a Eurozone country, and not realizing that it could not really be done.
As you remember, the executive director from Brazil was from the very beginning until the end of the procedure absolutely hostile for the Greek case. But let me present, to be more practical, one additional dimension between spring of 2010 and spring of 2011. The composition of the portfolios of many European banks concerning the Greek sovereign debts was different. And this is a very critical parameter for the political decision concerning the reconstruction, because the reconstruction is a technical issue, a very important legal operation, but first of all, it's a political decision. And the political body, the political leader, not in Greece, in Germany, in France, must take into consideration the situation of the banking system and the composition and the stratification of the portfolios concerning the bad Greek sovereign bonds.
Let me quickly try to wrap it up. I'll turn to Charles, because we left you on the side. Your book brings forth a number of suggestions to strengthen the fabric of international economic coordination and better manage sovereign debt crises. Could you please share with us a few of the key lessons learned for Greece, the markets, for Europe, and the IMF? Do you think all these agents have learned? Are there any lessons learned?
I think the learning process is still underway. And I don't mean to sit here presumptuously as an American and tell Greece what it needs to do in the future, but I would say, and let's start with Greece, that it's naive to think that just because Greece has received an investment grade rating that it's going to be sunny skies forever. Many of the structural problems and challenges in the Greek economy are deep-seated in Greek culture, in the Greek formation of the public service, and in the way in which the economy is administered, is managed, is regulated, the way in which ownership structures have evolved, the interest of vested interest in as in any country. So these problems will need to continue to be addressed if Greece is to really realize its full potential, which I think is huge. Secondly, and this is, I think, critical, particularly at a period like today, when you have the appearance of problems being solved, and at a certain macro level they have been. The banks are in such much stronger position. The economy is growing better than most European countries. Inflation is finally coming under control. But I think it's important to be realistic and realize this is a generational challenge at a minimum, which Greece faces to create a diversified, globally competitive economy which can meet the needs of all of its citizens. Secondly, I would say that bankers and yes, public debt officials still need to institutionalize some of the lessons learned. When bankers make bad risk management mistakes, they do pay a price, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the price that countries pay when they overborrow and can't manage their debt. And I think that there needs to be much higher standards. And here I don't mean at all to criticize Petros and his team. They were highly professional during these negotiations. But perhaps some of his predecessors could have been a little more cautious in their borrowing, as the bankers, and not just bankers, but investment bankers, insurance firms, etc., could have been more cautious in their lending. Finally, I think there are a lot of lessons here. Europe needs to strengthen the fabric of integration and cooperation. It needs to move more forcibly to an integrated fiscal framework, in my view. The euro will never be on a fully sustainable footing without a comparable fiscal framework to go alongside the monetary union. Now, I beg to take guidance from, obviously, from all of you in this room who are more deeply familiar with Greece than I am, but that's a firm conclusion I have. And finally, I would say there are a lot of lessons to be learned by the IMF here. They made a big mistake in the way they designed the adjustment program, particularly in the 2011 and 12 program, but they continued with this course of insisting that the focal point should be fiscal austerity, when in fact it should have shifted to structural reform. Now, under the leadership of Lucas and Evangelos and many others, they were able to elevate the importance of structural reform in that program in the spring of 2012 and going forward for a period of time. But it was never fully understood. The IMF is run by political leadership, which is understandable. But, you know, you turn any complex problem that has cultural, historic, structural, political dimensions, and you give it just to macroeconomists and expect them to come up with a perfect solution, it's not going to happen. So let me stop there.
One political question to Vangelis and one economic question to Lucas. The political question is, you know, in July 2015, we had a third program. Do you think that the Greek public and the political system has accepted the value of restructuring, or there's still doubts out there? Is it being accepted?
In July 2011.
15. When Syriza came to power, and then we
during the first semester of 2015, the main point for the debt and also for the PSI was that the Greek public debt is a kind of odious debt. The main claim of the Greek government is to rid off the debt, to overpass everything as a legal frame, until the shock of the referendum and of the famous negotiation of 15 hours between the Prime Minister Tsipras and the German Chancellor, and the acceptance of the famous third program under very tough conditions and terms. But the official position of the government of Syriza NL was absolutely negative for the PSI as a historical wrong choice, and the proposal made by the government was this famous theory of odious debt. As you remember, the Greek Parliament appointed the famous Truth International Committee on the Greek debt in order to organize the documentation for the odious character of the debt. But 6 months later, the government accepted the PSI, and the first state budget proposed in the parliament by Mr. Tsakalotos, the colleague of the governor, Yannis Tournaras, was a kind of eloge for the contribution of the PSI in the sustainability of the Greek public debt, and especially concerning the reduction, the impressive reduction of the annual servicing cost of the debt. This is the curb of the political position of the Syriza government during the critical year, the annus horribili of 2015.
Mr. Papadimos, here's me. I don't know if you want to answer it, but I'll ask it anyway. Looking ahead, given the high level of government debt in Greece, which is still high, you know, remember it's 160% of GDP, but also it's the high level of debt in other Eurozone countries. Are you concerned that a debt crisis may occur in Greece or in Europe over the medium term or over the long term?
Well, that's a good question to end the conversation. Well, it is true, and for reasons that would take a long time to explain, that Greek debt has actually reached a level which, by the end of last year, it was 180% of GDP, not 160.
Now it's 160.
There is
62.
Isn't this 180? I think so. There is, of course, concern, but I would say that over the medium term, over the next years up to 1932, the risk of any difficulties in servicing the debt, and therefore the risk of any debt restructuring is nil, is zero. And for two reasons. Because for one fundamental reason, as a result of the debt restructuring of 2011, but also as a result of reprofiling of the payment of interest rates and the servicing of the debt when it was done in 2012 and also later, the debt servicing ratio in Greece until 2032 is very low. So the country can service that debt without any difficulty. And of course the pressures are created when a country cannot service its debt. So over the next X years, going up to 32,
until 32,
there is zero, nil risk.
After 32?
Now later on, because of the reprofiling, the dynamics of the debt become more challenging. And this is the reason why it's correctly emphasized that we have to be very careful with regard to the design and the implementation of fiscal policy in the next few years, starting from now, in order to make sure that after 1932, the situation would be controllable. I believe that we have learned from past mistakes. So the right action will be taken, and therefore even beyond 1932, my assessment would be that the likelihood of a debt restructuring is very small.
Yes. Thank you. So it's nice to be optimistic. I'll leave the last comment on Charles if he wants to conclude and say something.
Well, I'll be brief. I would like to begin, though, by expressing my great tribute and respect for the three gentlemen on the stage with me, for the courage of leadership that they exhibited during the height of the crisis. Yes, was I under pressure? Were the nights long? Of course. But I only had to respond to a group of bankers, investors, creditors, right? Difficult, but when you look at the situation which Lucas and Evangelos and Gikas were in, and their colleagues in the Greek government, many represented here tonight, Petros and George, the bankers who went through this extraordinarily painful adjustment process, almost virtually wiping out their capital, the leadership challenges faced by the governor and the new governor here as he's guided the country's central bank through these last years, which have not always been easy either, the deputy governor. I saw true courage and true leadership. Yes, did I occasionally see glimpses of leadership in Berlin and other places from time to time? But the leadership I really was impressed by was here in Athens, and it has made a huge difference. You know, the numbers are all what the numbers are, but we're talking about the future of Greece and the future of Europe here. And you know, I learned years ago that the best debt restructurings are ones that begin where the creditor and the debtor are adversaries, wary adversaries, walking around the table at one another like two tigers, perhaps. But the best restructurings are the ones that end where the creditors and the debtor are partners in finding a solution. And I think this is what, largely due to these gentlemen and others, we achieved. And so I only do hope that we can all work together to both process and propagate the lessons learned here. I've touched upon many of them. I'm sure there are many others that could be shared. I want a final just word of thanks to you, Gikas, and the Banking Association, Hellenic Banking Association, for organizing this. Thank you as well for the for the generosity of distributing the books. There will be, in the coming months, a Greek language version of the book, which is going to be, I'm sure, very professionally published by Economic Publishing. Is Ms. Follini still here? If she is taking charge of the Greek version of this. But I hope you'll not wait for it, but dive into the English version. And it's not without a touch of irony that when the Banking Association ordered the books here, I rang the publisher up and I said, you know, this book is about a lot of bankers taking haircuts, so you're going to have to sell this book at a discount.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. We didn't have time for questions, I guess, unless you want to sit for another half an hour, but no, you don't want. Okay, thank you for coming. We had a great conversation. Bye.